Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. And in this video, we're going to be testing out the new update in Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced for FSR 4. And we're going to be comparing the Sapphire Pure 9070 XT against the MSI Shadow 57 Ti. And I'll have my entire test system specs down below in the comments, but it's a Ryzen 7 9800X3D paired with 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6400 RAM. And in this testing, we're going to be testing out 1080p, 1440p, 4K with and without upscaling turned on and ray tracing on and off. You're going to notice at the lower resolutions, there are some issues in performance because this game really doesn't handle high FPS that well. You start getting lower and lower 1% and 0.1% lows, but you'll see that when we start going through the benchmarks. And all of the rest of my test system details will be in the description down below. Now let's take a look. So starting off 1080p, very high graphics preset, and just DLAA and FSR turned on. So right off the bat, we're getting pretty much the same FPS between the 5070 Ti and the 9070 XT at around 162, 163 FPS. It doesn't seem to be able to go above this in the game. As you can see, there's lots of headroom on both GPUs, but it just can't exceed those FPS. Then looking below at the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows, the 9070 XT does perform better in this game, but that doesn't mean that's only for this situation with the game having issues with the high FPS. That's what we're seeing during that drive sequence. And indoors in this terminal, we are kind of seeing the same result. The 1% low and the 0.1% low is a little bit lower on the 9070 XT, but both are pretty much performing relatively similar. And as you can notice, there are some issues with the game itself. Let's go back a bit. As you can see right here, there is some issues with the game and reflections. This game definitely benefits from having ray tracing turned on, and you'll see that a little bit later on in the video when we turn ray tracing on. But overall, in the terminal, both GPUs perform almost identical. So now we're going to move on and turn ray tracing on. Still at 1080p. And in this case, oddly enough, the 9070 XT is performing better than the 5070 Ti because it's not getting as high of an FPS. So where the 5070 Ti is still maintaining 160 FPS, we're getting issues with that 1% low and 0.1% low. The 9070 XT isn't being affected by that, so we're getting much higher 0.1% lows and 1% lows, but we're getting lower average FPS. So this just goes to show you that with this game, capping your FPS or turning ray tracing on, just try to not hit that 160 FPS, gives you better performance because it brings up the 1% low and the 0.1% low. And now we're seeing the same thing. We're moving into the terminal. The average FPS is below that 160. So we're getting much higher 1% and 0.1% lows. Oh, now we're starting to get higher FPS, and then all of a sudden the 1% low and 0.1% low is dropping. So now we're down to 72 and 66, which is slightly better than the 5070 Ti. But overall, once you start getting above that 160, they both perform kind of the same. And then moving on and turning on quality upscaling FSR for the 9070 XT and DLSS. And DLSS in this game is only DLSS 3. It's not DLSS 4. You can mod the game to get DLSS 4, but we're going with the stock game, no modifications. In this case, we're back to the same thing. We're getting relatively similar performance. We get both are reaching 162 average FPS, which is dropping the 1% low and the 0.1% low down. And as you can tell, again, just looking at the overhead, the 9070 XT is at around 90% utilization, and the 5070 Ti is 75-80% utilization. So moving back to the terminal, we're seeing the same thing. It's dropping down to 163, 162. The 1% low and 0.1% low on the 97 XT is slightly higher than the 5070 Ti, but overall, this performance is kind of lacking just because we're using such high FPS that both cards are being impacted on the 1% and 0.1% low. Moving on to 1440p, very high settings, back to native resolution. And we're seeing a lot of the same. The game is fairly easy to run for the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti. So we're getting those high average FPS, but then we're getting the low 1% and 0.1% lows. And just looking at that frame time graph, it's all over the place. Even moving up to 1440p from 1080p is not enough to really drop the average FPS, as we're not coming close to hitting 100% utilization with native resolution and no ray tracing turned on. But overall, the 9070 XT is performing a little bit better on those 1% lows and 0.1% lows. Same, moving back into the terminal, we're seeing, you see a lot of weird flashing going on without ray tracing turned on. So same thing, we're sitting at an average of 163, 162, with the 9070 XT performing a little bit better on the 1% and the 0.1% lows over the 5070 Ti, but at this rate, it's not that much different. And you really can't compare it where there's issues with the game playing at those resolutions. So now turning ray tracing on, this is kind of the sweet spot for both GPUs. 1440p, max settings, max ray tracing. Now it bringing the average FPS down. So this is where the 5070 Ti is really starting to outshine the 9070 XT. So we're getting 122 FPS in the 5070 Ti relative to the 9070 XT at 100 FPS. And now our 1% lows and 0.1% lows are much higher, with the 5070 Ti at a 1% low of 98 FPS and the 5070 Ti at a 1% low of 87. There is some 0.1% low stuttering on the 5070 Ti, so we're seeing a 1.1% low of 46 versus a 0.1% low of 85 with the 9070 XT. But overall, I'd say the 5070 Ti is doing a better job with ray tracing turned on at 1440p. And now you're going to see here, this is what I mean why you need to have ray tracing turned on. We're not getting that weird flashing and artifacting from lights that the game really doesn't handle very well without ray tracing. And even inside, the 5070 Ti is performing better. So we're at 133 FPS with the 5070 Ti versus 120 with the 9070 XT. The 1% lows and 0.1% lows are a little bit lower than the 9070 XT. But overall, I feel like the 5070 Ti is doing a better job with the ray tracing. And now going back, and we're going to turn FSR and DLSS on to quality. And so the 5070 Ti, where it performs a little bit better than the 9070 XT, it's hitting that 160 FPS, which is then causing issues with the 1% low and 0.1% low. Whereas the 9070 XT is down around 144 FPS, so we're getting much better 0.1% lows and 1% lows over the 5070 Ti. But if you were to cap the 5070 Ti, you would see better performance in that 1% and 0.1% low. And the 5070 Ti is a more efficient card. We're only pulling like 250 watts versus 320 with the 9070 XT. Then moving back inside, as we go down into the terminal, the 9070 XT FPS jumps up to around 160 FPS. And once we hit that, the 1% low and 0.1% low starts to crash down. And it's kind of comparable to the 5070 Ti. It's a little higher because it started off higher at the entrance. But as we go through the tunnel, it's coming down with the higher FPS. But in the end, it still outperformed the 5070 Ti by a little bit on the 1% and 0.1% low. So moving on to 4K, very high preset, no ray tracing, no upscaling turned on. And the 5070 Ti is starting off a little bit better at the average than the 9070 XT. So it's 124 FPS versus 107. The 1% low is roughly the same between the two at 104 for the 5070 Ti, 101 for the 9070 XT. But the 9070 XT, for some reason, still performs better at that 0.1% low. So we're seeing a 98 FPS at the 0.1% low versus 73 at the 0.1% low on the 5070 Ti. But overall, the 5070 Ti is performing a little bit better than the 9070 XT between the average FPS and the 1% low. Now moving on inside again, and the 5070 Ti is performing a little bit better for the average than 57 or the 9070 XT. So we're getting 149 FPS with the 5070 Ti versus 138 on the 9070 XT. But the 1% low and 0.1% low inside, oddly enough, is performing worse than the 9070 XT. So we're seeing at 77, 1% low and 0.1% low, 67 versus well over 100 for the 1% low and 0.1% low on the 9070 XT. Now with ray tracing on, we're seeing the 5070 Ti again outshine the 9070 XT a little bit. We're seeing an average of 62, 61 FPS versus an average of 50 FPS with the 9070 XT. The 1% low is better on the 5070 Ti at 53 versus 42 for the 9070 XT. But then that 0.1% low is a little bit lower at this resolution with ray tracing on at 38 on the 5070 Ti versus 41 for the 9070 XT. But average performance, again, the 5070 Ti is doing a better job with ray tracing on in this game. Now back into the terminal, and we are seeing an average FPS of 61 on the 5070 Ti versus 48 for the 9070 XT. So again, it's performing better than the 9070 XT. The 1% low is a little bit higher at 58 versus 44. And then oddly enough, in this case, the 0.1% low is higher at 55 FPS versus 43 for the 9070 XT. So inside in the terminal, the 5070 Ti is outperforming across the board over the 9070 XT. Now turning upscaling on to quality. And using DLSS 3, the 5070 Ti is still outperforming the 9070 XT with its FSR 4. So we are seeing an average of 101 FPS. It's starting to come down a little bit versus an average of 83 on the 9070 XT. And then on the 1% low, the 5070 Ti is performing better than the 9070 XT again at 85 FPS versus 73. And then the 0.1% low is roughly the same between the two cards. So overall, the 5070 Ti driving outside in the daylight is doing better than the 9070 XT. Now moving on inside the terminal, again, the 5070 Ti with the settings is doing better than the 9070 XT. We see an average of 105 with the 5070 Ti versus 89 with the 9070 XT. The 1% low is a bit higher too at 98 versus the 1% low for the 9070 XT. And then the RTX 5070 Ti with this 0.1% low is roughly the same as the 9070 XT. Is not much different there. But overall, the 5070 Ti is performing better inside the terminal. Depending on what card you have, this game performs better at a lower FPS. So maxing out all of your settings, maxing out ray tracing, not using any sort of upscaling. If it's going to put you over that, 160 or 150 FPS, it's not recommended to use. It's better to go with native resolution, bringing those averages down a bit. That way your 1% low and your point rep 1% low is going to be quite a bit higher, and it's just going to make the game a little bit smoother instead of look at that frame time graph. And you notice that it's spiking all over the place once you start hitting that 160, 162 FPS. And I also highly recommend just turning ray tracing on for better visuals. As you can see earlier, when certain instances, especially in the terminal, there's a lot of flickering because the game just doesn't, rasterize that light very well. So using ray tracing definitely adds a better visual experience. You're not getting all that flickering. I've tested this before with some of the reflections in windows and stuff like that. It just doesn't look great with reflections with ray tracing off. But when you turn ray tracing on, the reflections look really good. It doesn't look so fake and weird when you're looking at reflections of a background, things like that. So ray tracing for this game is definitely a necessity to make it look a lot better versus not having ray tracing on. Whereas in other games, that's just not the case. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below.